The village had no name anymore. What once was a cheerful cluster of mud brick homes and rustling mango trees now lay beneath a thick blanket of gray. Smoke curled upward in lazy spirals from what remained, scorched earth, shattered walls, and the blackened skeletons of huts. The morning sun, veiled behind a curtain of smoke, turned the sky into a canvas of muted red and ash. Birds no longer sang here. The only sound that remained was the distant echo of gunfire and the crackle of embers still smoldering. And in the middle of this ruin stood a girl, small, barefoot, her tattered frock covered in dust and blood. Her name was Amira, and she was 9. She didn't cry. She had cried out all the tears the night before, screaming for her mother as the flames swallowed their house whole. She had clutched her baby brother until the heat forced her to let go. Now, she stood motionless, staring blankly at the road where trucks had rolled in, where men in black masks shouted in a language she didn't understand. Her childhood had ended in a single night, the kind of night that steals laughter from lungs and replaces it with silence. She hadn't spoken a word since, not even when the wind blew ash into her eyes, not even when the soldiers arrived at dawn. They came in tan uniforms, helmets covered in dust, boots heavy from days of marching. They moved through the village with grim urgency, checking for survivors, clearing debris, and marking by. And as one soldier rounded a corner, rifle slung across his chest, he saw her, that lone figure amidst the rubble, standing like a forgotten ghost in the ruins. He stopped. His name was Corporal Lucas Hayes, a 28-year-old medic from Nebraska, serving his second tour in a conflict he had stopped trying to understand. But this moment, this girl pierced through all the numbness, all the noise he had trained himself to ignore. She looked like a statue carved from grief. No trembling, no motion, just eyes that had seen too much for a child. He slowly approached her, raising a hand in peace. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "It's okay now. You're safe." No response, not a blink. Lucas glanced around, no adults in sight, just caved-in rooftops and the whisper of death. He took a tentative step closer. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Lucas. Do you have a name?" Still nothing. She didn't flinch when he reached into his pack and pulled out a water bottle. He twisted off the cap and offered it, holding it near her lips. She blinked once. That was all. But after a pause, she leaned forward and drank a tiny sip, then another. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." Other soldiers passed by, offering quick glances. One murmured, "We need to move, Doc." But Lucas raised a hand, firm and unwavering. "I'm not leaving her," he said. And so, in a place where everything had fallen apart, he did the only thing he could. He reached out and gently took her hand. She didn't pull away. Not immediately. Her fingers were cold, caked with soot and tiny cuts. But there was a flicker, a twitch, the smallest movement in that hand, as if her body still remembered how to hold on even if her mind didn't. Lucas stood slowly, never letting go of her. The convoy had orders to continue to sweep through the next village, to push forward, always forward, but Lucas walked beside her now, matching her steps, shielding her from the wind with his own body. He didn't know who she was, where her parents were, or what language she spoke. All he knew was that she was alive, and he wasn't going to let her be alone. The dust still hadn't settled from the last shell. Rubble blanketed the narrow alleyways of the old city, and distant gunfire echoed like thunder across a broken skyline. But amid the war-torn silence, a pair of footsteps raced with purpose boots, pounding the cracked pavement. Sergeant Darius Cole gritted his teeth, sweat cutting lines through the grime on his face as he ducked beneath a shattered archway. His eyes scanned the scene ahead, methodical and unblinking. The orders were simple. Clear the street, secure the area, and move on. But then he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10. Standing motionless in the shadow of a collapsed storefront, her clothes were tattered rags, more ash than fabric. Her tiny hands clutched a stuffed animal that had lost both its eyes and most of its stuffing. But it was the way she stared wood-eyed, unblinking, like a creature whose soul had already gone ahead without her, that made Darius freeze mid. She wasn't crying. That would have made more sense. But this child. She had cried all her tears long ago. She looked like someone waiting to vanish. He lowered his rifle slowly. "Hey," he said, his voice gravelly but soft, like a whisper, carried across sand. "Hey, little one. You okay?" She didn't answer, just turned and walked silently into the ruins behind her. Every inch of Darius screamed that this was a bad idea. Could be a trap, could be an ambush. But something in his chest pulled Tita a twist he hadn't felt since the early days of the war, when saving civilians still meant something. Before he'd stopped seeing faces and started seeing threats, he followed. The deeper they went into the broken remnants of the city block, the quieter it got. The wind stopped, the hum of distant tanks faded. All that remained was the ghostly shuffle of her bare feet over debris. Darius followed, rifle lowered but ready, every nerve on edge. And then, like the punchline to a cruel joke, she led him into a room, a half-standing shelter with 3 walls and a missing roof. There were 2 bodies inside, a woman and a man. Her parents, judging by the way her tiny hand reached down to touch the woman's face with unbearable gentleness. The man's hand was still outstretched, as if he'd tried to shield them both from the blast that ripped away their lives. Darius looked away. That's when the girl finally spoke. They told me to run, she whispered, but I didn't. I thought if I stayed close, they'd come back. Darius crouched beside her. He had seen death in every color and language, but this was something different. This was the ruin of hope. He didn't try to explain, didn't try to comfort her with words that meant nothing. Instead, he reached out and held her hand. She flinched at first. She was used to running, used to being chased, but he didn't let go. You're not alone now, he said. I got you. Outside, the crack of another shell split the air, closer this time, but Darius didn't move. He stayed right there beside her, holding her hand like it was the last true thing in a world gone mad. Minutes passed, maybe hours, maybe days in that fractured pocket of time, and then the girl finally looked up at him. Are you going to leave me too? The words gutted him. No, he said, not ever. He scooped her into his arms, feeling how weightless she was. A child who had gone too long without safety, food, or sleep. As he stepped back into the open, his gums crackled to life. Bravo 6, report. You disappeared off-grid. What's your status? Darius clicked the mic. This is Cole. I've got a civilian, a child, extracting now, a child. The voice on the other end hesitated. Cole, we don't have room for. She's coming with me. He cut in sharply. You'll make room. Silence. Then understood. Rendezvous at extraction point Delta. Darius didn't bother saying thank you. He just moved fast, careful, dodging between shadows with her head resting against his shoulder. She didn't speak again, just held the ragged toy tighter and kept her eyes closed. Every step through the dead city felt like a gamble, every corner a potential ambush. But Darius didn't stop. He knew what it meant to give up, and he had promised. As they reached the edge of the war zone, the whine of helicopters grew louder overhead. A black military chopper descended behind a crumbling factory, kicking up clouds of dust as it landed. His team was already on board, staring out with confusion as Darius emerged with the girl in his arms. No one said a word. He climbed in, sat with her in his lap, and kept holding her hand as the bird lifted off into the smoke-choked sky. The pilot turned briefly. What's her name? Darius looked down. I don't know yet, he said, but we'll figure it out. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the little girl opened her eyes and nodded. The next few weeks blurred into a rhythm of whispered commands, shared rations, and the constant pulse of survival. Zoya clung to the soldier Arava as though he were a single candle against a pitch-black world. At night, when artillery thundered in the distance, she would crawl closer to his side, burying her face into the canvas of his uniform, breathing in the strange mixture of gunpowder, mud, and warmth. It reminded her of safety, a smell she hadn't known in years. Arav, too, had changed. The man who had once barked orders across the camp now knelt to tie Zoya's torn shoelace, held her hand when crossing a collapsed bridge, and taught her how to listen for mines. His fellow soldiers watched silently, never mocking him, for they understood something sacred had passed between them. Zoya wasn't just a rescued child, she was now his mission. They passed through shattered villages where stray dogs picked, through burnt rice sacks where laundry still flapped from wires with no homes beneath them. In one town, Zoya picked up a doll half-burnt, missing an eye, and cradled it silently. Arav didn't stop her. He simply nodded, wiped the dust from its face, and placed it in her worn satchel. The terrain worsened with every mile, forests scorched by napalm, riverbanks littered with bloated logs that weren't really logs. And still, Arav never let go of her hand. One afternoon, while they rested in the hollow of a bombed-out school, Zoya asked him the question that had been clawing at her mind. Why me? Arav was cleaning his rifle, the soft metal clicks rhythmic and comforting. He looked up, brows furrowed as though surprised. What do you mean? You saved me. You carry me when I'm tired. You share your food. I see you give your blanket to me at night, even when you're cold. Why? He stared at her, jaw working as if the words were heavy. Finally, he exhaled. Because once, I didn't. Zoya tilted her head, unsure. There was a boy, he continued. 3 years ago, about your age. I saw him in a trench, wounded, crying for help, but we had orders. Enemy territory. Too risky. I left him behind. Zoya's eyes widened. She waited. Next day we found him, executed, hands still tied. The silence between them stretched like a chasm. Arav didn't cry. His face was carved from stone, but Zoya reached out and gently touched his hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That evening, she took off the scarf she always wore and draped it around his neck before they went to sleep. It smelled like charcoal and soap and some long-forgotten flower. Arav didn't remove it. Days turned into weeks, and their strange little bond became legend in the platoon. The ghost and his shadow, some soldiers called them, others simply nodded respectfully when they passed, acknowledging something, wordless, that pulsed between the two like static. Zoya began to change too. No longer just a lost girl with hollow eyes, she had a voice now. She learned how to read a compass, clean a wound, and even bandaged one of Arav's sprained ankles. With strips from her own shirt, she started humming again tuneless melodies that reminded her of lullabies long since drowned in screams. One night, as the group took shelter in the shell of a cathedral, Arav drew a small folded mat from his boot and beckoned Zoya close. They sat by a candle stub while he traced lines with his finger. "This," he said, pointing, "is the border. Beyond that, there's a town called Eldhoven. Refugees. Safety. We're heading there." Zoya squinted. The border looked impossibly far. Dozens of rivers, forests, and unknown checkpoints lay between. "But it's too far," she whispered. "Maybe," he admitted, "but we'll try." "Together," Zoya nodded. The candle flickered as if agreeing. The next few days were the most dangerous. Rumors spread that a rogue faction of soldiers was moving through the area. No allegiances. No mercy. Entire villages were vanishing overnight. Arav and his unit moved like shadows now, speaking only in hand signals, eating in silence, and sleeping in shifts. Still Arav never let go of her hand. Not once. Then came the ambush. They were only 2 hours from the border when the first shot rang out. Arav's unit scattered, returning fire from behind trees and rocks. Zoya dove for cover, heart in her throat, clutching the doll in her satchel as bullets shredded branches above her. Arav was nowhere in sight. A voice bellowed. She turned and saw him, crouched behind a twisted metal crate, motioning frantically. She ran. A bullet nicked the dirt near her foot. Another tore through the sleeve of her coat. Still, she ran. Arav leaped from his cover, grabbing her and dragging her behind a fallen tree. His eyes were wild with panic. "I told you never to run without me," he shouted. "I didn't," she cried. "I ran to you." Something cracked in his expression. Pain, pride, terror, love. Then he pulled her close, shielding her body with his own, as gunfire erupted again. The battle didn't last long. Arav's unit managed to push back the ambushers, but they paid in blood. 2 men didn't get up. One lay with his helmet blown clean off. The rest gathered themselves in grim silence, eyes scanning the treetops for snipers that never came. Arav stood slowly, wincing, blood soaked through his side. "You're hit," Zoya gasped. "It's nothing," he lied, staggering. She helped him walk. The border was close now. The final hill rose ahead, grassy and golden, in the afternoon sun. From the top, they could already see the white tents of Eldhoven in the distance. Flapping in peace, Arav dropped to one knee. "Go," he whispered. "Run, you're almost there." Zoya shook her head violently, tears streaking her face. "I'm not going without you." His hand, trembling and blood-slick, reached out and once again found hers. "I never let go of your hand," he whispered. "Don't let go of mine now." She did in single quotes together. Bleeding and breathless, they walked up that hill, step by painful step, hand in hand. And when the guards at the refugee checkpoint saw the injured soldier and a little girl covered in dirt but unbroken, they ran to help. But even then, neither one let go. The camp was a ruin of tents and dust by the time morning light crept in. Fires smoldered low. The wounded moaned softly in makeshift beds. There were no birds, only silence, and the low hum of fatigue that hung over the survivors. Like a wet sheet, Captain Raynor sat against the wheel of a burned-out vehicle, his rifle across his lap, but his eyes weren't on the horizon. They were on the little girl who now clutched the sleeve of his uniform with one hand and a ragged stuffed bear with the other. Her name was Luma, and she hadn't said a word since the blast. Raynor had seen 1,000 broken things in his years. Of service, bridges, towns, boaties, but nothing haunted him like the sound of a child who had stopped crying. That silence was not peace, it was absence. It was the kind of quiet that came after too much had been taken away. Her hair was singed, her skin was smudged with soot and blood, but she wouldn't leave his side, even when the medic offered warm broth and clean water. Her small hand held his like it was all that tethered her to this world. He didn't understand why she picked him, of all people. Maybe it was the way he found her buried under a collapsed wall, barely breathing. Maybe it was because she saw something in his face when he lifted the debris and whispered, "I've got you." Whatever it was, he didn't push her away. He couldn't. She was broken in a way that no medicine could fix, and somehow, without speaking, she made him her anchor. Raynor didn't have children, he never married. The army had been his life. Since he was 18, moving from one hellhole to another, chasing peace with a loaded gun, but Luma stirred something in him that felt ancient, not paternal, not exactly. It was something deeper, protective. She was a symbol of what war took away from the innocent. He couldn't bring back her parents or rebuild her village. But maybe, just maybe, he could give her something that felt like safety. He built her a bed in the corner of his tent, with spare blankets and a rolled-up jacket for a pillow. He found crayons in a donated supply crate and gave her an old notebook to draw in. She didn't speak, but she drew. That was the first sign she still had something left inside. Color. At night, she drew suns and trees and crooked houses, with smoke curling from the chimneys. Sometimes she drew soldiers, always with sad eyes, and always with one holding a little girl's hand. The other soldiers called her Captain's Shadow. She followed him everywhere, even to the latrine, until he gently explained with a rare smile that he needed privacy. She sat outside, and waited, her little bear always tucked under her arm, its one remaining eye staring out like a sentinel. Whenever Raynor returned, she'd rise quietly and slip her hand into his again. as if she needed to confirm he was still there, still real. The days bled into one another. The war never really paused, but for a brief time, their corner of the world quieted. The captain filed for emergency custody under international humanitarian protocol, surprising even himself. His superiors raised eyebrows, but no one had the heart to separate them. When the helicopters came to deliver fresh troops, Luma cried for the first time, not from pain, but from fear that Raynor might be sent away. He wasn't. Not yet. And from that moment on, she slept with his dog tags in her hand. But war doesn't let go that easily. One night, while Raynor was helping unload medical supplies, the sirens screamed again, not a drill. Mortar. The enemy had returned. The camp exploded into chaos, and in the frenzy, Luma was nowhere to be seen. Raynor's stomach dropped. He tore through tents, shouted her name, though she never spoke. He prayed she'd answer. Then, through the smoke, he saw her standing frozen between two burning trucks, eyes wide with terror, the stuffed bear limp in her hand. He ran like a man possessed. Bullets snapped past him. Fire licked at his boots. He didn't care. Nothing mattered but her. He reached her just as debris from an overhead explosion came crashing down. With no time to think, he threw himself over her, wrapped her in his arms, and let the world go black. When he woke up, it was quiet again. Pain roared through his back, but Luma was alive. She lay beneath him, curled like a kitten, untouched, and when she looked up at him, her lips parted. Ray, she whispered, one word. His name, the first word she'd said in days. It hit him harder than any shrapnel ever could. They airlifted both of them out that night. Raynor wasn't the same. After that, his back would never fully recover. But the biggest change wasn't in his body, it was in his heart. For once, he didn't want to go back to the Frontmanias. He didn't want to disappear into another conflict. He wanted to take Luma somewhere, quiet, somewhere green, where children could laugh and color and speak. When they landed in Germany, he filed every paper, signed every form, begged every official until he was allowed to bring her home. His home. Not a barracks, not a tent. A real home. The kind with doors that locked not to keep danger out, but to keep warmth in. And even, though she never said much, she always held his hand, even when she started school, even when she fell asleep on the couch, even when they watched cartoons together and laughed, like war never touched them, because her childhood had been destroyed. That much was true, but he never let go of her hand, and he never would. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Zara had ever known. The war outside continued to roar like a distant storm, but inside the compound, with Captain Raynor and the other children, a strange kind of quiet existed. It wasn't peace, no, not even close, but it was a pause, a fragile bubble built on the unlikeliest foundation. Trust. Zara began to move more freely now. She was still quiet, still hesitant, but something in the soldier's consistent presence, his steady voice, his unwavering hand in hers was changing her. He never forced her to speak, never asked about the horrors she'd seen, but he did offer her small moments of safety. He sat beside her as she picked at army rations. He wrapped her in a thicker coat when she shivered at night. And when the nightmares came, when she cried out in her sleep, tangled in blankets and flashbacks, he was there within seconds. I've got you, he would whisper, kneeling beside her cot. You're safe here. I swear it. One morning, as the sun crawled across the broken concrete of the shelter yard, Zara walked up to him on her own and held out a crumpled, dirt-stained drawing. It was of a house, simple, crooked lines, a red door, and two stick figures standing side by side, one small, one tall. That you? Raynor asked gently. She nodded. He tapped the taller figure, and me. Again, a small nod. That was the first time he saw her smile. It was fleeting, shy, and faint, but it cracked something in him wide open. She trusted him. Against all odds, she had allowed herself that impossible thing, belief. In someone again, Raynor knew that the other soldiers noticed. They gave him nods, knowing glances. Some muttered things like soft spot or guardian angel, but none dared mock him. Not after what they'd all seen out there. In fact, some of the younger soldiers, those barely older than the children they were rescuing, started looking to him as a sort of guide. He had become more than just a soldier with a duty. He had become a protector in the truest sense. Someone who bore the weight of children's silence and screams both. Zara, meanwhile, started doing things that stunned everyone. She began helping the medics by handing over bandages. She sat next to a boy who had refused to speak since he'd lost his leg, holding his hand until he finally broke down in tears. And when new children were brought in, bloodied, broken, and terrified, she would be the one who gently handed them water, whispered words they could barely hear, or simply sat beside them in silence. It was as though the strength Raynor had poured into her was now pouring out into others. A quiet ripple of healing through a sea of ruin. But war does not respect moments of healing. Peace, when it comes, is always brief. It was a night like any other. Rain pounded the tin roof, and gunfire echoed like a heartbeat in the distance. Raynor had just finished helping Zara and the others settle in for the night when the emergency sirens howled. A surprise air raid. The compound shook. Walls groaned, lights flickered, soldiers scrambled. He sprinted to the barracks, heart hammering, for himself, but for them, for her. The children were awake, eyes wide with terror. Some screamed, others froze, but Zara didn't scream. She ran straight into his arms. "I don't want to go underground again," she whispered. "I can't breathe down there." Rainer didn't hesitate. He swept her up, grabbed 2 more kids with his other arm, and shouted at the others to follow. They sprinted through the chaos, debris falling, alarms shrieking, and fire kissing the edges of the sky down in the bunker. Crammed shoulder to shoulder with crying children and panic-stricken adults, Rainer held Zara close. She was trembling like a leaf. "I'm right here," he whispered again and again. "I'm not letting go." When the ground shook, she buried her face into his jacket. When the lights died out entirely, she didn't scream. She clung to his sleeve, knuckles white, but she didn't scream. Hours passed. The raid ended. When they emerged, the sky was bruised. The shelter partially collapsed, but the children were alive. All of them. And it was because of her. Because of him. Because of their bond, a bond forged not in comfort, but in the most unforgiving fire of all. War. In the days that followed, the evacuation team finally arrived. International aid forces had pushed through the Western Line, and the UN was airlifting civilians. The compound would be emptied. The war wasn't over. For these children, escape was finally within reach. Rainer was given a new order: escort the group to the northern field, hand them over, and report to the new command post. But when the day came when the helicopters thundered overhead and the gates were opened, Zara refused to let go of his hand. The UN official tried to coax her, offering sweets, showing her pictures of the new shelter. She didn't even glance at them. She just stared up at Rainer, eyes wide, a storm of questions behind them. "I'll come with you," he told her gently. "I'll walk you right up to the door. You'll be okay." But she didn't move. Then came the words that silenced even the blades of the helicopter for him. "Are you leaving me too?" Rainer crouched down, hands resting on her tiny shoulders. He looked her straight in the eye. "I don't leave people, Zara, not you." She nodded slowly, but only when he promised he'd return and find her, no matter where the system took her. "As long as I breathe, I will find you. You're not alone anymore." She walked into that chopper still holding his hand, and even when the engines roared and she was lifted into the sky, her eyes never left him, not until clouds swallowed the last trace of her fragile silhouette. They moved from village to village, to shadows in a war-torn land. The soldier, known to the world as Lieutenant Raza, and the little girl Alaya, who had once cowered beneath a crumbling school desk, as the dust of conflict choked the skies and homes burned like paper. Raza held her hand like it was the only map left in the world that made sense. He had been given a new mission, though no command had assigned it. It wasn't etched in any briefing report, nor printed on any battle order. It was written in Alaya's terrified eyes and silent tears. She never asked for help, never begged to be saved. But something about her broken innocence had compelled him to act. Raza had seen things, unspeakable things. Things that twisted a man's soul and made his hands tremble when the night fell too silent. But with Alaya beside him, trembling but alive, something shifted. He cleaned her scraped knees with the corner of his scarf. He taught her how to cover her ears when the mortar screamed from the hills. He'd lost men under his command, had survived ambushes that should have killed him. But here he was, now risking everything to save a child who had no one else. And he began to wonder if this, perhaps, was his redemption. They found temporary shelter in the ruins of a bombed-out hospital. The night was bitter, and the wind howled like mourning mothers. Raza wrapped Alaya in his army jacket and gave her the last of his rations. She ate in silence, her eyes distant, locked on things she couldn't say. That night, he didn't sleep. His rifle rested across his knees, while Alaya's head lay on his lap. His mind churned with memories, screaming villagers, the flash of explosions, and most of all the moment he found her. He couldn't shake the image of her tiny blood-smeared hands, clutching a photograph, burned at the edges. A man and woman stood smiling in the picture, her parents perhaps gone now. The next morning brought more than sunlight. It brought a patrol. Not enemies, but barely Alizan, unorganized militia sweeping the region. Raza knew one of them, a man from the academy. They exchanged coded words, low and urgent. The soldier's eyes flicked to Alia and back again. "Give her to the convoy," the man urged. "She'll be taken to the camp. Safe, you're needed at base." But Raza shook his head. "She's safer with me. You can't protect her forever. Then I'll protect her for as long as I can." The man didn't argue further. He only nodded with a look that said more than words ever could. "You've changed." And he had. This wasn't about orders anymore. It was about something deeper, something raw and human. Maybe it was the memory of his own daughter, buried in a small grave back home, taken by illness while he was halfway across the world. He hadn't been there to hold her hand in the end. Maybe that was why he couldn't let go of this one. Days blurred into one another. They moved mostly at night, avoiding main roads and sticking to forgotten paths between burnt fields and hollow homes. Raza taught Alaya how to recognize danger signs, how to stay still when she heard helicopters, how to follow signals, how to read the movements of shadows. She became quiet but sharp, learning fast, her innocence replaced by a brittle alertness. But there were moments, small ones, that reminded him she was still a child, like when she giggled at a frog hopping across their path, or when she whispered a lullaby to herself in the dark. One evening, as they neared the outskirts of the green zone, Raza noticed the trail a set of bootprints not far from their path. He gestured for Alia to stay low, creeping forward until he spotted them mercenaries, likely hired by rival factions. 3 men, armed and too confident. He could avoid them, take the long way around. But then he heard Ida cry. A woman, possibly injured, civilian. Raza turned back to Alia. She looked up at him, as if sensing his question. Stay here, he whispered, planting her behind the twisted shell of a vehicle. No matter what happens, don't move until I come back. She nodded, fingers tightening around his jacket sleeve before she let go. He moved like a ghost, silent, invisible, deadly. The mercenaries never saw him coming. He neutralized 2 before the third even realized his companions were down. The third fled, shouting into a radio. The woman they'd cornered was bloodied but alive. Raza helped her up, whispered reassurances. He turned to head back to Alea, but his heart dropped. She was gone. Panic ignited in his chest like wildfire. He sprinted through the ruins, calling her name in a whisper shout, rifle clutched tightly, eyes scanning every shadow. Then he saw it, a smear of dust where she had crawled, footprints leading away. He followed the trail until he found her, crouched behind another wreck, eyes wide, clutching the photograph again. She had hidden, just as he'd taught her. But she looked scared not just of the enemy, but of being alone. He fell to his knees beside her, breath ragged. I told you not to move, he said, voice both stern and broken. I thought, you wouldn't come back, she whispered, and in that moment, Raza understood something. More than food, more than shelter, more than safety, what Alia needed was certainty. She needed someone who would come back, who wouldn't leave her behind. And he swore to be that person. I'll always come back, he said, gripping her hand. As long as I'm breathing, I'll be here. She nodded. Not with joy, not with relief, just a quiet understanding. A child who had seen too much, but who now had one thread left to hold on to. And that was enough for now. By now, word had spread through the camp about the soldier with the scarred face who had taken in the little girl. Some whispered about it with curiosity, others with silent reverence. But neither Zaira nor Lieutenant Haroun paid any attention to gossip. Their days had become a rhythm of shared survival, him helping restore broken fences, ferrying water to elderly women who could no longer carry buckets, and Zaira quietly folding clothes with the refugee women, her hands moving in the same small, practiced circles she once used on her doll's dresses. That it had been nearly 6 weeks since the explosion that shattered her home and took everything: her parents, her dog, her voice. In all that time, Haroun had never asked her to speak. He'd never forced a word or a question, but he never let go of her hand either. Not in the rain, not during the food lines, not even when higher-ups questioned why a Special Forces lieutenant was shadowing a mute girl through a civilian displacement zone. They couldn't understand, they hadn't seen what he had. Zaira was never just a child he rescued. She was the reminder of why he wore the uniform, not for orders, or politicians, or borders, but for moments like that day in the rubble, when a small, trembling hand reached out to him through a crack in the cement, and he said, I've got you, and never let go. One day, near the end of September, aid workers arrived with a bus, announcing that orphans would be taken to a temporary shelter in the city. It would have running water, classrooms, beds with real mattresses, and even therapy. Dogs. The camp buzzed with cautious hope. Papers were signed. Parents tearfully kissed children they couldn't feed, and names were called one by one. When they called Zaira Bashir, Haroun froze. She looked up at him with a question in her eyes, but no words. Her hand tightened instinctively around his. An aid worker stepped forward, smiling kindly. She'll be okay, sir. The program is good. It's clean, safe, but Haroun couldn't speak either, not for a long beat. He looked down at Zaira. Her lip trembled, and suddenly, like a breaking dam, memories flooded his mind. A flash of her cowering in the rubble, her thin arms over her ears, the smell of burning wires, her bloodied knees, her scream, mute but thunderous, seeing the back of his brain. No, he couldn't. He knelt to her level. Zaira, he said, his voice thick. They want to take you to a nice place. You'll sleep in a real bed, no more mud. You'll learn things, maybe make friends. She just stared, unmoving, silent. Her fingers still knotted in his sleeve. His next words cracked something inside. Himbarai, I can't come with you. Her bottom lip curled. A silent tear fell down her cheek. She didn't cry loudly, didn't wail. She just looked at him like the world was ending all over again, as if bombs were falling from the sky once more. And he realized, for her, maybe they were dot, so he did something no one expected. He stood up, turned to the aid worker, and said, She's not going. The worker frowned. But sir, she has no family, no legal guardian. You're not? I'm her guardian now. You can't just, I'll make it official. Haroun said firmly, she stays with me. It took 3 days of paperwork, 3 superior officers, and 1 midnight phone call to a colonel who owed Haroun a favor from the mountains of Swat Valley. But he made it happen. Zaira stayed. And something changed after that. She began drawing again. At first it was just chalk in the dirt, simple shapes, circles, trees. Then came a pencil, and soon she was sketching people, women in hijabs, children skipping rope, a man with a beard and broad shoulders, always holding a girl's hand. She didn't need words. She told her story in lines and shadows. Weeks later, Haroon found her newest sketch pinned to the tarp wall of their tent. It showed a younger version of herself, sitting alone in a broken house, windows shattered, sky dark. In the next panel, his figure reaching out. And in the final panel, the two walking together under a single umbrella, even though the rain fell all around. He stared at it for a long time, then folded it gently and kept it in his chest pocket beside the bullet scar that had nearly ended him years ago. From that day forward, the camp knew them simply as the soldier and the girl. And when new families arrived, confused and afraid, it was often Zaira still silent. But Shirhu took their hands, led them to food, pointed out the clean water, and introduced the children to the safest places to play. A soldier had once reached into darkness and held her hand. Now, she passed that light on. And even though war had stolen her voice, her drawings spoke louder than most speeches. Aid groups eventually began collecting them, some even printed them in journals, calling her the silent witness. But for Haroon, she was something else. She was proof. Proof that even in the ashes of war, humanity could bloom, and that sometimes, just sometimes, not letting go could save two people at once, even if only one of them was a child. The war was over, not officially, not with parades or treaties, but in the way that war ends for those who survive it. When the bullets stop flying and the rubble settles, and the only sound left is the heartbeat in your ears and the questions that have no answers. Layla stood beside Sergeant Beckett on the edge of the ruins that used to be her village now, a mosaic of scorched earth, twisted metal, and shattered memories. She held his hand tighter than ever, even as aid helicopters circled overhead and rescue teams in crisp uniforms rushed through the broken streets. She had grown up in this war, her innocence pulverized by drone strikes and midnight raids, but somehow, she still had that one grip of warmth anchoring her, a soldier who refused to let go. A woman from the International Relief Corps came toward them, her clipboard full of logistics and policies, her voice polished but impersonal. "We can take the girl to the capital. She'll be registered for relocation," she said, already motioning for another aid worker to approach with a blanket. Beckett stepped between them. "She's with me," he said quietly, with a weight that made everyone pause. His face was grimy, bandaged near the temple. His uniform soaked in dirt and old blood, but in his voice was something immovable, kind of voice that doesn't ask permission, it informs reality. The official tried to object. "With all due respect, Sergeant, the child needs processing. She needs a guardian, not a soldier." Beckett looked down at Layla, who was already clinging tighter to his sleeve, her small eyes wide with fear. "You're wrong," he said. "She doesn't need a guardian. She needs me." And with that, he lifted her gently into his arms, turned his back on the bureaucracy, and began walking toward the field where the remaining evac helicopters were being prepped. No one followed. No one dared. They all had their orders, but they weren't the ones who'd carried her through fire and shrapnel, who'd watched her cry silently at night, or held her hand while she slept, just to keep the nightmares at bay. Night, in a safe zone far from the front lines, Layla fell asleep in a cot for the first time in years, without the sound of distant gunfire echoing in her ears. Beckett sat nearby, bruised and exhausted, but awake. He'd made calls, spoken to commanders, pulled every favor he could muster. This girl was not going to vanish into some cold system or get lost in the mess of post-war paperwork. He wasn't sure how yet, but she would have a life, one that didn't smell of ash and fear. He'd failed to save too many in his years of service. Not this time. Not her. Weeks passed. Layla began to laugh again, quietly at first, like she was unsure if she was allowed to. Beckett found himself learning her language in bits and pieces, enough to understand when she pointed at things and asked questions, or when she clutched his arm during nightmares and whispered in panicked bursts. He responded with calm tones, with firm hands holding hers, with promises he made good on. He taught her chess. She taught him how to braid her hair. At the shelter, the other soldiers would smile, shaking their heads at how the gruff, no-nonsense sergeant had turned into a protective father overnight. "She's got him wrapped around her finger," one joked. Beckett just nodded. "That's exactly where I want to be." Eventually, the paperwork went through. Layla was no longer a case number. She had a name, a future, and most importantly, a home. Beckett brought her back with him to the States, enrolling her in a small public school, explaining everything to the staff. She might cry at sudden loud sounds. She might not talk much, but she was smart and brave and kind, in a way only those who've known loss can be. The teachers were hesitant at first, unsure how to handle a war orphan in their classrooms. But Layla surprised them. She painted vivid, haunting pictures in art class. She aced math exams without even trying. And when one boy tried to bully her on the playground, she stared him down with a calm that silenced everyone. She didn't need to yell. Her eyes had seen more than any child should. The boy never bothered her again. Beckett, meanwhile, learned how to be something new. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a guardian, a mentor, a late-night homework helper, a reader of bedtime stories. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and wonder at how strange life was. He'd seen entire cities leveled, comrades lost in ambushes, missions that went horribly wrong, and yet, the hardest, most rewarding thing he'd ever done was making pancakes for a little girl who once thought monsters lived in every shadow. One evening, Layla brought him a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing. Stick figures. Messy, but heartfelt. The little girl, holding hands with a man in a soldier's helmet, both of them standing under a blue sky. Above them, in shaky letters, were the words, "Thank you for not letting go." Beckett's throat tightened. He put the drawing on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a star. That night he didn't sleep much, not because of bad dreams, but because of the peace that comes from knowing you did something right. Really right. Years passed. Layla grew into a confident, fierce young woman. She spoke on stages about her past, about war, and healing, and hope. She never mentioned Beckett by name, but everyone in the audience could feel him in her words. When she graduated, she handed him a card that simply said, "Because of you, I lived." And not just survived, but really lived. And Beckett, who had walked through more horrors than he could ever speak aloud, smiled quietly. He kept the card next to his military medals, not above them, not below, just beside, because some victories aren't won in battle. They're won in living rooms, in whispered comfort, in stubborn, unwavering love. She may have lost her childhood, but she gained something stronger, a future, because that soldier never let go of her hand, and never would, and never would.